Pilate was held responsible. The Jews were responsible. The Jews were responsible. In verse 11, look at this. Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." He who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, most of us would immediately think, well, that's Judas, right? Isn't Judas the one who delivered Christ? Yes. Judas delivered Christ to the Jews. But who delivered Jesus to the Romans? Who delivered Jesus to Pilate? The Jews. The Jews did. And Jesus said they have the greater sin. See, Romans 13 tells us that there is no authority except that which is given by God. And we need to remember that at all times. There is no authority except that which is given by God. Pilate was in a place of authority. He was doing what God had ordained for him to do. You know, we talk about Pilate's decision, and certainly we have to remember the sovereignty of God. It was God's sovereignty from the very foundation of the world that Christ would suffer for sin, that Christ would be put to death. Christ was not standing there praying that Pilate would change his mind. Jesus had already declared that he was going to die. But Pilate was a part of the plan of God, but yet, as we've talked about, man's responsibility, God's sovereignty, Pilate was held responsible. But Jesus says the Jews have a greater sin. The Jews have a greater sin. He who delivered me to you has the greater sin. See, the Jews knew better, or at least they should have known better. Pilate was just doing what he was appointed to do. But the Jews, however, had the greater sin because they had the law and the prophets. They knew the Messiah was coming. They could have known to the very town the place of his birth and the manner of his kingdom. They had the law and the prophets. They had all this before them. They had truth. And you know what? To whom much is given, much is required. So Jesus said, those who delivered me to you have the greater sin. And again, there's a principle there for us as well, isn't it? We're going to be held accountable because we have so much truth at our disposal. We have so much truth before us. There's a greater accountability with those who know the truth. Hebrews 6 says, anyone who knows the truth and rejects it is crucifying the Son of God afresh, putting him to open shame. So we hear the truth this morning. We know that Christ died for sin once for all, the just for the unjust. We know that Christ paid the penalty for our sin, and unless we place our faith and trust in Christ, then we're all doomed for hell. That's the truth. And we're going to be held accountable for the truth that we've heard. And as Christians, we know the truth that we need to live a life holy and separate for God's glory. And we are going to be held accountable for the truth that Pilate was guilty. He was responsible, but there's a greater responsibility associated with the Jews. See, this morning we are held to a higher standard because we know the truth. We know the truth. So we see the mentality of the crowd and the guilt of the crowd. Let's look thirdly at the influence of the crowd. Verses 7 and 8. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Now, if you're more afraid, what were you before? You were afraid. Now Pilate is panicking. He's even more afraid. Why? Because he heard that statement. He makes himself out to be the Son of God. See, at first Pilate was afraid because he was afraid of this crowd. He was afraid he was going to lose his job. He was afraid that they would report him to the emperor like they'd done on a couple of occasions. But now he's even more afraid. You know why? Because this man that he just had scourged says that he is a son of a god. Now, Pilate was not thinking in the Jewish context of the Messiah. He's thinking in the pagan context of the Roman civilization. See, the Romans were very superstitious. The Romans were very superstitious. They believed many times that gods would become men. Do you remember that in Acts chapter 14 when Barnabas and Paul, oh, this must be Zeus. This must be Hermes because they're such powerful men. The gods have come to live among us. And so Pilate, look at that verse 9. He entered the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from? Are you a god that's dwelling among us?" You know why he was more afraid? Because he says, "I'm in big trouble. I just had a god scourged. What's going to happen to me?" So he was even more afraid. More afraid. You know, fear is a motivating factor when we deal with the crowd. But you know, that's not the influence of the crowd. Look at verse 10. Here's where we see the real influence of the crowd. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Pilate is saying, I can do with you whatever I want to do. Not so. Not so. Let me ask you two questions. What did Pilate want to do with Jesus? Let him go? That's exactly what Pilate wanted to do. He wanted to let Jesus go. What did he do with Jesus? He gave him up to be crucified, didn't he? So do you see the influence of the crowd there? Pilate had the authority to release Jesus, but he didn't have the power. He didn't have the power. Pilate wanted to do the right thing, but as we say in South Alabama, he didn't have the guts to do it, did he? He didn't have the courage to do what was right. Do you see the influence of the crowd there? There can be times when if you're running with the crowd and you want to do, you know what's right, and you want to do what's right, but the crowd won't let you. That's what we call peer pressure. Peer pressure. Pilate had the authority, but he did not have the power. And again, we see the sovereignty of God is at work here because we know that it was God's plan that Jesus be crucified, but yet Pilate found himself totally helpless. So strictly from a human perspective, we can be influenced by the crowd to do wrong when we know better and even when we want to do what's right. That's the influence of the crowd. This is a classic example of peer pressure. Peer pressure. And Pilate gave in to the pressure around him. Fourthly, we see the condemnation by the crowd. Verse 13. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, and he sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. As we said earlier, the Jews didn't bring Jesus to Pilate for a trial. They had already condemned him. What they wanted was permission to execute Jesus. But Pilate knew that he could not execute an innocent man without some type of trial, so he tries to go through the mockery of a trial, but it still doesn't work. But they wanted and they needed Pilate's approval. So the moment has come. Pilate sits down on the judgment seat and he's ready to pass judgment. And without even knowing the significance of his statement, Pilate presents to the Jews their king. Now, it was the day of preparation, verse 14. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king."